Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a concept that sounds like dry, modern corporate jargon, but actually has a deeply historical and, frankly, devastating reality. We hear a lot today about public-private partnerships, right? PPPs, a government and a private business teaming up. But what happens when that partnership is taken to its absolute, most extreme historical limit? Well, today we are exploring the dark history of sovereign delegation and colonial extraction. We're going to look at how absolute monarchies literally outsource their supreme state powers to private companies and how that very model eventually paved the way for one of the most horrific humanitarian disasters in human history. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the sovereign corporation, followed by monopolies that waged war. Then we'll pivot to Leopold's private empire, examine the red rubber system, and finally wrap up with the legacy of extraction. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The sovereign corporation and the birth of the company state. To really grasp this, we have to look back at the incredibly expensive, super risky 16th century scramble for Asian trade routes. European powers were absolutely desperate to secure commodities like spices and silk. But sending massive fleets across the globe, that was an unprecedented financial gamble. So this extreme need for capital led to what we call sovereign delegation. This is the transfer of supreme state powers. We're talking making laws, waging war, signing treaties directly to a private corporate entity. States essentially outsource their governmental authority to private investors. It was this totally unique mashup of private money and government backing that birthed a completely new kind of entity.
And what is truly fascinating here is the sheer legal weight of these creations. The charters of the English East India Company, founded in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, were astonishing documents. Queen Elizabeth and the Dutch States General literally issued these to grant exclusive monopoly rights over trade in the East Indies. But they did way more than just protect trade. These charters functioned almost like a constitution for a brand new kind of global corporate state.
Section 2. Monopolies that waged war, and corporations with armies.
To really understand these entities, we have to completely separate our modern understanding of a standard business from these historical behemoths. Just consider the terrifying scale of powers granted to the VOC and the EIC. They were authorized to wage war and sign treaties. They could govern entire overseas territories, like the VOC's control in Indonesia, for example. They maintained massive private armies and navies. They minted their own currency. They even operated their own courts to enforce laws. So the crucial takeaway here is that these were not just businesses. They were legally recognized as quasi-states operating all over the globe, blending corporate profit motives directly with the lethal force of a sovereign nation.
Section 3. Leopold's private empire. A fiefdom, not a colony.
This brings us to the late 19th century, where this model evolves into something even more alarming. We're moving from state-chartered monopolies in Asia to Africa. By the mid-19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium desperately coveted an overseas colony. The problem? The Belgian government simply was not interested. So Leopold took matters into his own hands. At the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, he used some incredibly cunning diplomacy. Under the guise of a philanthropic front, the International African Association, which supposedly aimed to promote free trade and end slavery, he claimed the entire Congo River basin. Just like that, he became the absolute ruler of an area larger than Western Europe, a staggering 80 times the size of Belgium itself. Now, this brilliantly and tragically illustrates the terrifying evolution of sovereign delegation. Let's compare the two. The VOC, as massively powerful as it was a state-chartered monopoly. It ultimately had to answer to the Dutch States General. The Congo Free State, however, was totally unique. It was a completely private fiefdom, answering only to one single man, King Leopold II. It was his exclusive private property, known as the domaine privé. He lacked even the most basic state oversight, and he engineered the entire system purely to maximize his own short-term personal economic gains. Section 4. The red rubber system, or corporate extraction at any cost. Unsurprisingly, Leopold quickly abandoned any pretense of free trade or philanthropy. He had an empire to fund, and he found his golden ticket in ivory and eventually a massive global boom in the demand for rubber, thanks to the invention of inflatable bicycle tubes and early automobiles. To exploit this, he established concessionary trusts. Let's walk through the brutal, step-by-step reality of this forced labor process. Step 1. Leopold decreed that any uncultivated land was vacant and therefore owned by the state. So suddenly, everything belonged to him. Step 2. The Congolese people were forced into serfdom, required to deliver rubber and ivory to state officers or private companies as an in-kind tax. Step 3. Unlike tapping trees in Brazil, this rubber came from wild vines. Workers literally had to slash the vines, lather their bodies with the latex, and then painstakingly and painfully scrape it off their skin, which often tore out their hair. And finally, step 4. Enforcement. If quotas were missed, Leopold's agents imposed draconian methods. Villages were burned, women and children were kidnapped, and workers were beaten, executed, or mutilated. The amputating of hands became a horrifyingly common practice. I want to pause here for a second and just let this number sink in. 10 million. In the 22 years that the Congo Free State existed under Leopold's absolute rule, an estimated 10 million Congolese lost their lives to murder, starvation, and disease. That was half of the entire population at the time. It is a staggering, almost unthinkable toll of corporate extraction operating entirely without boundaries. These atrocities were so severe that they sparked unprecedented global outrage. In 1890, George Washington Williams, an African-American Baptist minister, traveled across the Congo. In an open letter to Leopold, he coined a phrase that we still use to this day to describe the absolute worst of human behavior. He called what was happening crimes against humanity. These horrors also deeply impacted the novelist Joseph Conrad. He witnessed the plunder firsthand while captaining a steamboat there in 1889, and that experience directly inspired his famous novella Heart of Darkness. Section 5. The Legacy of Extraction and the Fall of the Free State.
So, how did this nightmare actually end? Well, this unprecedented horror triggered a rapid mobilization of global public opinion. Starting with William's letter in 1890, the tide began to turn. Then, in 1903, British consul Roger Casement publishes the Casement Report, officially exposing the killings and abuses. This leads directly to the 1904 founding of the Congo Reform Association, which is arguably the world's very first large-scale human rights group. The public pressure, both globally and locally, became insurmountable. By 1906, the Belgian parliament voted to step in, and in 1908, they officially annexed the Congo Free State. This finally removed Leopold from control and transitioned the territory into the Belgian Congo.
But as you might guess, Leopold did not go quietly. His exit strategy was incredibly cynical. He basically insisted on a massive payout to give up his rights. We're talking 110 million francs extracted to cover his outstanding debts, 45 million for building projects back in Belgium, and another 50 million in future receipts from the Congo. And on top of all that, before finally yielding power, he systematically destroyed the state archives. He burned the financial and interior department records, literally attempting to wipe away the historical evidence of his exploitation. Which brings us to the legacy we are left with today. The story of the VOC, the EIC, and ultimately Leopold's Congo Free State is a very stark reminder of the immense danger that arises when the line between sovereign state power and private corporate profit is completely erased. Now, obviously modern corporations don't command private navies or claim absolute ownership over millions of people, but they absolutely still wield massive global influence over economics and politics. We use tools today, like corporate registers and transparency initiatives, to try and keep that power in check. But the fundamental question remains, and it's one I want to leave you to think about. Where is the line between state power and corporate influence drawn today? And are modern systems actually strong enough to hold that line? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning.